Many years ago, I was given a little tiny jar of strawberry freezer jam. When I tried it, I was absolutely amazed at how brilliant it tasted. It was so much better than regular strawberry jam that I was like, it's not even playing the same game. And I thought to myself, I need to know how to make this. Hi, I'm Amy on A Lolly Life. And do you know what I love? I love homemade bread with an extra thick coating of strawberry freezer jam on it. You know what else I love? You. I even love you more than an extra thick layer of strawberry freezer jam on some homemade bread. I'm going to tell you how to make strawberry freezer jam. And the first step is pick your berries. I generally use strawberries because they are yummy, and they are one of the more cost-effective berries that are available to me. Tell me in the comments what your favorite berry or berry combination is. I actually really like raspberries, and so I like to make a half raspberry, half strawberry berry mix. I use the recipe that's on the back of a Pectin package. I use Mrs. Wage's freezer jam Pectin. I've tried several different kinds. Some of them have worked okay, some of them have not worked okay. I've had really good success with Mrs. Wage's. I buy this on Amazon and at like Tractor Supply store. I included a link in the description if you're interested in going and getting some. I will tell you, you probably should not buy more of this than what you're actually planning on using that year, because they have a best if used by date, and that actually is kind of important with Pectin because it does go bad, and so it's like yeast where it might not raise the bread if the yeast is too old. Well, Pectin that is too old might not actually turn your jam into jam. It might just be runny and never set up. But it does need to say freezer jam on it in order for it to work. I use the recipe that's on the back. The recipe calls for 4 cups of crushed mooshed berries, and 1 dry pint of berries equals about a cup of mooshed berries. Another thing that this recipe says on it is that you can use frozen berries, and if you do, you have to thaw them first. I've never actually used frozen berries, so I don't know how that would compare to the fresh ones, but it is apparently an option. Step number 2 is clean your jars, or whatever it is that you're planning on putting your jam in. Anytime that you are preserving food, you need to start with clean, fresh jars or containers. And just because the jar or container was fresh when you put it away does not mean that it is clean enough for you to preserve food in it. Even something as simple as strawberry freezer jam. So it is actually important to wash the jars or containers just before you put the food in them. You can hand wash jars or containers or dip them into boiling water, but my favorite way to do it is super easy. I put it in the dishwasher, and I run the dishwasher, instead of with soap, I run it with vinegar. So there's no soap residue or anything like that on the jars, and it just keeps them clean, and when I'm ready to use them, they're nice and hot and steamy and completely fresh and clean. You should get the jars in the dishwasher before you do everything else so that the jars are ready when you are ready to use them. Step 3, clean and cut the berries. I like to cut the berries and chop off the leaves before I clean the berries, because sometimes there's little bits of the leaves that get stuck on the berries when you chop the leaves off, and when you wash them, then that washes them away. But if you decide that you want to wash your berries before you cut them, then you will need to wash them a second time after you cut the tops off, because you need to make sure that there's no leaves or anything in the berries. If you have a special way you like to cut the end off of the strawberries, then you can do it that way, but it really doesn't have to be any more difficult than cutting just enough of the berry off to get the leaves and the stem off the very tippy top. When cutting the top off the berry, push the leaves back and cut close to the end of the berry. If you cut off the top quarter of the berry when you're cutting the leaves off, then you're wasting berry, and you're probably going to need extra berries. I try to cut the end off my berries in a little bit of a U shape to save as much of the berry as possible. Depending on how you decide to moosh the berries, you might want to cut the berries up into a little bit smaller pieces. When I have really big berries, I tend to chop them into slightly smaller pieces because they go through my food processor better. Number 4 is moosh the berries. Moosh them. Moosh, moosh, moosh. Once the berries are cut and cleaned, then you need to moosh them or squash them, or however you decide to prepare them so that they're not whole berries. You can do this with a fork or a potato masher or in your blender. Every way that you moosh the berries is going to end up with a slightly different texture of the jam. And I just really like the amount of strawberry piece that's left with the amount of moosh that I get when I use my little food processor, and so even though it takes a little bit longer, I tend to use this food processor because I really like the texture that it creates. But you can use your blender and do a whole bunch all at once. You will need 4 cups of berry moosh, and you measure it out and put it into a large mixing bowl. Step 5 is combine your sugar and pectin. This is a very important step. Do not skip it. On the back of the package, it tells you how much sugar to add. This says 1.5 cups of sugar, and you actually do have to add the sugar that it calls for. It is important to have that sugar in there. If you do not add the sugar, or you don't add as much of the sugar because you're trying to make the jam less sweet, it will not set up. I know because I've tried it several times. And then you end up with strawberry syrup and not strawberry jam. And while strawberry syrup is really good, it's not what I prefer on my sandwiches or toast. And so you do have to actually add the sugar. You measure out your sugar and put it in a small bowl, and then you add your pectin to it and use a fork to stir it all up. It is very, very important to do this step. You absolutely have to mix the sugar and the pectin before you add it to the mooshed berries. If you were to add this pectin directly to the mooshed berries, it would clump up and it just doesn't turn out right. It is not a pleasant sight because you stir and stir and stir trying to fix your mistake and it doesn't work, and you're so upset because you put this time and effort into it and now you have clumpy, weird goop in your berries. And yeah, mix the pectin with the sugar before you put it in with the berries. It's very important. By mixing the pectin and the sugar allows the pectin to kind of get separated a little so it doesn't clump up. Much, much better. Number 6 is push the like button. Just kidding. Actually, number 6 is taking your sugar and your pectin that's all stirred up and pouring it into your measured out berry moosh and then stirring that all up. Number 7 is put it into clean jars or containers. It will still be syrupy when you put it in the jar or container. It takes about 30 to 60 minutes for it to set up. It sets up a little bit faster if you've put it in the refrigerator. You need to leave about a ½ inch of headroom at the top of the jar, and that means you cannot fill the jars until they are completely full or almost completely full, because when the jam freezes, it will expand a little, and if you have filled the jar up too full, then when it expands, it bursts at the seams and makes a big mess. So don't fill the jar up too full, leave a ½ inch of headroom. Before you put the lid on the jar, you should wipe off the rim. When you are canning, you need to wipe off the rim of the jar so that you get a good seal. And while we're not actually canning the freezer jam, it is a good idea to wipe off the rim of the jar so that it's clean and fresh and not sticky. The lids need to be freshly washed as well. Lids don't wash very well in the dishwasher, and so what I tend to do is I will have a pot of boiling water and I will just put the lids in the pot of boiling water for a minute or so before I use it. Step number 8 is store the extra jars of jam in your freezer. This is freezer jam, and what that means is the jar of jam that you're using, you store that in the refrigerator like you would regular jar of jam. But the jars of jam that you're not using, you should store that in your freezer. You cannot store this jam in the pantry. They are not actually sealed. Remember, I said we didn't actually can it. Even if the little button at the top of the jar goes down for some reason, it's not shelf stable. You cannot store it in your pantry. It will rot. When you take a jar of jam out of the freezer, you will have to wait a while for it to thaw before you can use it. I know that it's called freezer jam, but you cannot actually spread it until it's had a chance to thaw, so you will have to wait a little bit for it to thaw before you can spread it, even though it's freezer jam. It doesn't spread when it's frozen. This is the end of another Lolly episode. We show who we are on the inside by the kind things that we do and say. Nobody else has to notice or appreciate the things that we do to be kind for them to count. And the good news is, if we don't like who we are on the inside, we can start to change into a kinder, gentler person anytime we want by using kinder, gentler words and smiling. I love you. And I'll see you on the next episode of A Lolly Life.